And I said to myself, without really saying it, but just knowing it right off, this is the sort of thing that sets me apart from Daddy, and him from me, and both of us from everybody else. Not simply that I saw the porch light come on and he didn't, and nobody else would care anyway, but more that Mama could switch on a single bulb and switch on something in me with it, something of sadness and grief, and shot through with the melancholy of twilight, something I could not be sure Daddy would know as I knew it, feel as I felt it. And I told myself how it was probably no more than pure chance, and maybe a little grim luck that caused me to turn and look just when I turned and looked. And I said to myself, this won't ever happen just this way again, not even having to say that either, but just knowing it and concluding it right off.
The Blue Ridge Mountains, Southern Virginia. In 1987, writer TR Pearson bought 40 acres of land here, then had his house built atop the hill. Acclaimed by critics as a striking new voice in the tradition of Faulkner and Twain, Pearson begins his day's work each weekday morning at dawn. T.R. Pearson is the author of 4 comic novels of the South: A Short History of a Small Place about an eccentric suicide, Off for the Sweet Hereafter about a pair of convenience store robbers, The Last of How It Was, a family history, and Call and Response about love and marriage in a small town.
I think I'm trying to illustrate my vision of the South, of the part of the South that I write about, within the various limitations of prose fiction. I'm trying to play off the conventions of the novel. For instance, Off for the Sweet Hereafter is a kind of romance that goes badly wrong, and I had the opportunity there to put 2 characters together with Jane Elizabeth Firesheets and Benton Lynch, who had a relationship together in which they were well aware, and I was trying to indicate all of the physical properties at play when people throw themselves together in love or romance. It's not like television, and it's not like the movies. And when they're rolling around in the all together in the hay, they tend every now and then to bump accidentally together, and things don't work right. And life for them is awkward, and their relations together are awkward. And that's the way I find things usually, because I know how my life is, and nothing works out like in light fiction and movies. Everything is a little different somehow. They retired to the barn floor almost straight away, or actually as immediately straight away as they could encourage their legs to take them, and they rolled around on the wood planking and grappled with each other for a spell until Jane Elizabeth Firesheet suggested and then insisted on the hayloft, not so much for the loft part of it this time, but more for the hay part of it, and naturally Benton Lynch agreed with her emphatically, almost before she could finish suggesting it, as he was in a state which had rendered him acutely agreeable and thoroughly emphatic, and he laid his head back and watched Jane Elizabeth Firesheet sweep behind, ascend towards the barn roof, after which he endeavored to ascend some himself, and even succeeded at it, but without any grace to speak of. They rolled around in the hay some and grappled some, like they'd rolled around and grappled on the wood planking, and then Jane Elizabeth Firesheets took the liberty of separating Benton Lynch from his trousers and from cotton briefs. Or anyway, she had commenced to take the liberty of separating Benton Lynch from his trousers and his briefs, when she discovered she had to separate him as well from his Harrington and Richardson buntline revolver of extraordinarily high caliber, which she'd taken for something long and steely from the outset, but not a gun exactly. And she held it and looked at it and cocked it and uncocked it and pointed it and ran her tongue out her mouth and back in her mouth again and said, "Ooh," in a tone Benton Lynch had never heard used on a revolver before.
I eat here for 24 years. Instead of gaining weight, I've lost weight.
Is it important for you to be hearing the voices of the people who you're trying to capture on paper?
I didn't think it was for a time, and when I was out of the South for a while, but I found it was. I needed to hear those people talk. And I pick up a lot of material that I use just from eavesdropping. I'll be in a hardware store, or I'll be down on the street somewhere, and I'll hear two people talking, and one of them will say something, will phrase it a particular way, will tell a tale that I'll just stop and pick up. And I've pilfered items from all over the place, just like a fly on the wall, just sitting and listening.
Tell me about the narrative style. The way people speak in your novels, is that an approximation of real speech, or is it some stylized vision of your own of local language?
I'm not really trying to approximate speech, I don't think. I'm trying to approximate the nature in which stories seem to me to be told in the South, and everybody has an anecdote to tell, and the anecdotes are usually only marginally related to whatever the subject at hand might be. And any Southerner, and I guess most anybody anywhere really, who's had a great aunt to sit down and talk with, she's always talking about people who are dead, who you don't know, and everything is off on a tangent, and not much is to the point. And so these books, that novel, The Short History of a Small Place in particular, was meant to tell a story, but tell it very obliquely, so that everything seems to hit a glancing blow to the main gist of the thing. Daddy said it was a bed sheet, a fitted bed sheet, and he said she was wearing it up on her shoulders like a cape with two of the corners knotted around her neck. She was standing barefoot on an oak stump, he said, standing on the one nearest the front walk where there was ordinarily a clay pot of geraniums. And he said her hair was mostly braided and bunned up in the back, but for some few squirrel-colored strands of it that had worked their way loose and hung kind of wild and scraggly down across her forehead and almost to her nose. She was talking, he said. Then he stopped himself and creased the newspaper twice and put it in his lap, and he changed it to ranting, full-fledged bad planking in the attic ranting. It was something about Creon, he said, something about Creon and the stink of corpses. Mama came from out of the kitchen and stood there in the doorway of what Daddy called the sitting room, where he had his chair, his magazine hamper, and his RCA television, where Mama kept her drop-leaf maple table, which none of us had ever eaten from, not even at Christmas, and which was cluttered up with 3 shoeboxes, Grandma Young's crystal punch bowl, an assortment of odd-sized flyers from the AMP and the Big Apple, and a set of decorative scales that had mysteriously struck a balance between the one pan full of rubber grapes and waxed bananas and the other containing a 40-watt light bulb, 8 cents in pennies, and 3 unrelated buttons. Mama crossed her arms over her apron bib and worked the small of her back against the edge of the door frame. Daddy drew a tarragon out of the pack in his shirt pocket and looked straight at me and talked straight at Mama and said, "Madness."
The family of Lewis, the Benfields and the Yunts, are central, and their view of the world is central to your fiction. How is your own family akin to Lewis's?
Well, I think my own family is full of talkers, and the Benfields, as I see them, actually live in the house that my mother grew up in, and they live in the town that my parents grew up in, fictionalized of course, and as I remember it. And I think they're kin to my family in the sense that they do talk to each other, and otherwise they're just products of imagination and stories I've pilfered and things I've heard. I don't think they're strictly based on the family, truly.
And are the families in general in the rural South that you grew up in or experienced the same sort of tribal feuding families that we find in literature and history of 50 and 100 years ago?
I think they can be. They certainly don't have to be, but the ones that I've chosen to write about are. And I just remember as a child hearing everybody in my family talking about one thing and another, hearing my great aunt and my grandfather arguing about the most minuscule items for no apparent reason than they were of a disposition to just bicker back and forth. And I've just grown up with that and heard it all my life. And it was not venomous in any way. It was just a part of their natures. It was talking. It was communicating back and forth.
Tell me about Neely, this fictional universe and town you've created. Where did that arise?
That arose from my recollections of being in Reidsville, North Carolina, and spending time at my grandparents' house. And it certainly, as I remember it as a child, and I've been back since then, it's nothing like I remember it to be. But I found it to be such a curious place. I grew up in the suburbs in Winston-Salem, which is somewhat of a larger town, and Reidsville is relatively small, I'd say 15, 16,000 people, and my grandparents knew most everybody who lived there, and they would parade by in the course of a day. You could sit on the front porch and everybody went by, walking or driving or something, and I just remember the sense that every face had a name and a personality with it, which was not the case where I lived. And I would sit with my grandfather up on the porch, and they would speak to whoever came by and tell me who they were and what they were up to and why they turned out the way they turned out, and they just knew everything about everybody. It was a different sort of place altogether.
Thomas Reed Pearson was born in North Carolina in 1956, the son of Thomas Elwood Pearson, a safety engineer with a trucking company, and Sarah Ann Burton. His parents were high school sweethearts at Reidsville. After they married, they moved 50 miles away to the suburbs of Winston-Salem, where Tom and his sister Beverly grew up.
This is my father's father as well. He was
Pearson attended North Carolina State University in Raleigh, where he went on to get his master's degree in English literature. After school, he taught part-time, painted houses, and did carpentry work to support himself. At the age of 25, he began to write, he says, strictly to amuse himself. By the time a publisher showed interest in his work, he was already on his third novel.
My father's parents, on the other hand.
After his first book appeared, Pearson lived in New York City for 2 years. Then he moved to the Virginia Hills near a small town called Dougspur. It is a quiet place to think and write. He is so isolated here, he can shoot target practice with his Lee Enfield 303 without disturbing the nearest neighbor. Another reason Pearson settled here was to be within 2 hours' drive of his parents and sister, who still live in Winston-Salem.
We went to Kitty Hawk from the early 50s to, 1964.
Oh.
Pearson drew on memories of his own family to create the Benfields and Yunts of his fiction. A scene in his novel, The Last of How It Was, is based on a memoir of his family's summer outings at a beach house at Kitty Hawk.
We didn't but usually do most of the same things we'd done the year previous at Kitty Hawk, which were themselves regularly the things we'd done the year before that, which was partly on account of our choices were not altogether considerable, and which was also, whether we knew it or not, partly on account of did not we want to do but what we'd done previously, just like we'd done it, so as to demonstrate for our own satisfaction that one piece of our lives did in fact hold steady while everything else refused to. Consequently, we always set out with a swim straight off, me and my sister Bev and Daddy and Grandpa that waded mostly but went anyhow, and watched the rest of us go up to our armpits in the most extraordinarily cold water I've ever got wet with, the sort of water that's never been even remotely acquainted with the Gulf Stream. So we shrieked and shivered and walked across the sandy bottom all stiff and goose-pimply, and could not bend our legs much and could not wholly raise our arms or wholly lower them either, until after a time when we simply went dead everywhere the ocean covered. So we swam in the frigid water and wandered the beach and rode up to the store and back and down the other way too sometimes, just to see what was down there, and we laid on the dunes amongst the sea oats and listened to the wind blow through them and sat at the round table and talked to Tilly through the kitchen door and listened to Cuba on the radio at night, and sometimes went out all together onto the beach where we laid our heads back and looked at the sky that there was so considerably much of, with the ocean on one side and the sound on the other. And Grandpa would point out what constellations he knew, which was the two dippers mostly, and would raise up his arms and indicate with his fingers a spot of light he would insist was Mars. And Aunt Bessie would look up along his arm and along his finger and say how it wasn't Mars at all, how it wasn't but a star away off somewhere. And she would raise her own arm and point off another way entirely. Mars, she would say, that Grandpa would humph at. And then would not anybody but breathe and but look and but wonder too.
The thematic interests in your novels and the speech and the settings lead to a lot of comparisons with Faulkner. What do you think are the connections, if any, between your work and Faulkner's?
I think they're pretty superficial. I'm a big Faulkner fan and have been for a long time. Certainly, he was a Southerner and I'm a Southerner. He wrote in very long sentences and I write very dense prose as well. But Faulkner's Faulkner's vocabulary is far more formal than mine is, and Faulkner's concerns were far more serious, I think, than mine are in many ways. And I think Faulkner was much more misanthropic than I would ever pretend to be.
Well, let's talk about that. You create characters who, women who chew tobacco and spit, and there's a lot of general ignorance, some simple-mindedness, a lot of prejudice in your characters. Do you really like your characters?
I do. I like them very much. I think by and large they're simple people, and I think I'm a relatively simple person. I don't differentiate myself from them, but I do like them. They all have faults, and their faults are pretty open, just like their virtues are. Nothing is hidden. You can discover exactly what they're about very briefly. But I'm very fond of them nonetheless.
What do readers who live in rural North Carolina think of your portrayals of local folk?
I think the readers who live in North Carolina, some of them anyway, who I hear from or who review the books, tend to think that I am misrepresenting their recollections of their past and of their parents' past, and I think that kind of misses the point. I'm not trying to recreate the South per se. What I believe I'm doing is creating a realistic setting, as realistic as I possibly can, realistic characters who have their own internal motives for doing what they do, and I realize at the same time that they're all confined within the conventions of the novel, and so what they do is played off against the various expectations of fiction. I always know that they're in a novel, and that way I can create some kind of tension between the character realistically in the novel as a form.
You said you thought Faulkner's concerns were perhaps more serious than yours. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think Faulkner, as he's perceived popularly, the books that people read are basically his serious novels. It's The Sound and the Furious, Absalom, It's Light in August. The books I'm fondest of are the Snopes novels. I think Faulkner, as a humorist, was much more effective than Faulkner as a serious novelist. But the books that are taught are by and large the serious ones, the grave ones, and that's the public perception, basically. And I don't think that I'm in any way as high-minded as Faulkner is taken to be. I don't think he necessarily was that, but I believe he's taken by especially scholars to be that way.
TR Pearson's books are increasingly high-minded. While a comic perspective is still at the core of his work, his second novel, Off for the Sweet Hereafter, concludes with the sheriff pondering the grave consequences of his actions. And in a pivotal scene in The Last of How It Was, the narrator recounts how his grandfather had once beaten a black man named Gilliam to death for stealing a car.
And Granddaddy said, "God damn you," and brought his face down into the Gilliam's face and said it again, while with the hand empty of shirt front he felt around in the pine straw until he laid his fingers on the knot he'd seen there and took it up and raised it overhead, which Daddy said was when they caught hold of him at either arm and held him, and Daddy told him, "No, Chief." And Mr. Clay Weathers said, "Just Mr. Buck," 2 times, and Granddaddy fought against the both of them but could not work loose and could not see the prospect of it either, and so quit and just stood with Daddy on the one side of him and Mr. Clay Weathers on the other, and with that Gilliam direct before the 3 of them, that Gilliam that still just sat, Daddy said, and still just touched himself with his fingers, and did not for a time look but at his own blood, and did not for a time take in air but to breathe with, until at last he lifted his head and looked full at just Granddaddy and commenced to talk at him, commenced to talk in a voice so thick and low that were not the words plain and decipherable straight away, but came to be clear soon enough. And it was swearing, Daddy said, was swearing pure and absolute, not like any swearing he'd ever heard before or ever hoped to hear again, on account of it was not your wild and was not your agitated profanity, like most profanity is, but was just plain talking that happened to be vile and mean and evil, so plain and so vile and mean and evil that they did not know what it was they were hearing until well after they'd commenced to hear it, until well after they'd commenced to decipher it even, on account of did not any of it suit and mesh, not the eyes to the words and not the words to the voice, as it all called for heat, and as it all called for passion, but did not get any of either, which Daddy said made it worse somehow, the swearing that was not spat and hollered, but just said against Granddaddy, and against Daddy, and against Mr. Clay Weathers, and against Aunt Sister, and against all their kin, and against all their kin before them. against just everything they were and everything they ever had been, and not spat and not hollered, but just plain said, just plain told outright, which Daddy guessed was why they did not know what it was straight off, as they had not ever been told outright before, but listened like they did and heard what they heard and knew directly what it was, which Daddy figured was when they let loose of him. Let loose of him even before he jerked and strained to get loose, and he did not need to jerk and strain to do, as he was free already, and Daddy said he brought it down almost before he could draw it back, brought it down quick and savage, and hit that Gilliam flush across the forehead with it, and then hit him again near about the same place, and laid him full out on the pine straw, maybe killed already, Daddy said, but hit him again anyway. And with such considerable force and zeal that Granddaddy could not keep his own feet, and so fell onto the pine straw himself, partly, and fell onto the Gilliam somewhat too. The Gilliam that was purely dead by then, Daddy said, but got shook anyhow by Granddaddy, who took up as much green shirt as each hand could manage and brought that dead Gilliam's face up to his own face and said to it, "God damn you," and then just let loose with his fingers and watched that Gilliam fall back like he fell back and hit like he hit, which Daddy said him and Mr. Clayweathers watched too, just stood by and looked at, not like it was death and murder, Daddy said, but something entirely otherwise, something bigger and grander, and altogether more significant and satisfying, like maybe Granddaddy was all of us, and like maybe that Gilliam was all of them, and like maybe those blows to the forehead did not just do in a man, but maybe the old troubles too, and the old woes and the old friction, and only a man also, and a man as well. But Daddy said they had the carcass too, and the bloody pine knot and the hollow stomachs had told them maybe it was just death, and maybe it was just murder.
There's a timelessness to your fiction, the universe of Neely and the fictional world you've created. Do you think the character of the rural South has changed any in the past 25, 50, 100 years?
The character of the South as a whole has, certainly. I think it's there's been, an import of people other than Southerners all over, but in the rural South, and you can look around yourself here, not much has changed. Everything is pretty much as it was, and most everybody you run up on in this stretch of country is a Southerner, and a lot of people have lived their whole lives here. But the larger cities, the Atlantas and Charlottes and those places, they've changed quite a bit.
When blacks appear in your novels as secondary characters, they're generally treated unjustly. Are you trying to make a point or point out or emphasize that negative character?
There's certainly race distinctions in the South, and not only in the South, but since I write about the South, that's what I speak of. And I still hear from Southerners lots of inadvertent ugly talk, I think, just in the course of conversation about blacks and whites and the relations between them. But I think in the South you have to understand that white Southerners and black Southerners have lived together for a long time. There have been all sorts of barriers, certainly to the black race, but I think the proximity of the two has always been relatively close physically. And so white Southerners and black Southerners know each other awfully well, which feeds on sometimes a kind of animosity and sometimes something to the contrary.
What do you think your novels say about the relations between the classes in the South?
I think the relations between the classes in the South are very fragile and tentative. They're not fixed in any way, and I do believe that there is a kind of social strata in the South that's broken down not just by black and white, but starts at the lowest level, which would have to be white trash, which I think Southerners would agree with you is about the lowest form of life here, and then it would work up from there. But there are class distinctions, certainly.
Are you concerned with telling it as it is, reporting on the world that you see and grew up in?
I try to be, and I think, well, I'll use one example from Off of the Sweet Hereafter. My mother wanted to read part of that, and I gave her the manuscript, and she got pretty far enough along for it to become reasonably obscene and a little profane, and just couldn't read anymore. Was offended by it, and I don't think she's ever finished it. But my only defense was I didn't want to press her to read it. I told her, if this offends you, don't read it. But I can't write a novel about white trash, black trash, any kind of low form of life, and sanitize it, and then it wouldn't be true. I think part of the problem with writing about any level of society that is offensive is that you have to represent it as offensive or you're not being truthful, and that's what I tried to do. Of course, the novel is meant to be funny at the same time, but it's to show these people, as some of them anyway, especially Jane Elizabeth Firesheets, is essentially amoral and capable of almost anything. It was all considerably savage and brutal, even if it did take place on a sofa mostly. The clothes got tore some and balled up and thrown all round about the room, and in the throes of passion, Ben Lynch bucked up of a sudden and loosened Jane Elizabeth Firesheet's front teeth with the back of his head. But there was not much lasting harm done otherwise, and they banged together and gyrated and even fell off the sofa and onto the hardwood without missing a beat. And for a spell, Ben Lynch nose-whistled like he had not nose-whistled any time lately. And Jane Elizabeth Firesheets oohed and squealed and bounced and jiggled and generally made such a spectacle of herself that Ben Lynch began to figure maybe the gyrating and the oohing and the nose-whistling and the milky white parts and the plum-colored parts, too, were all, in fact, the best things to partake of and have in this life, or maybe even the only things worth partaking of and worth having. But before he could decide and conclude outright that there was not anything better, that there was not anything more, really, he commenced to tingle and commenced to pant and flush and felt himself surge and discharge, and knew of a sudden that there was actually not anything worth partaking of and worth having, especially not the milky white parts and the plum-colored parts and the wheat straw parts, too. And Jane Elizabeth Firesheets exhaled most profoundly and laid the back of her hand across her forehead and said it was the best she'd had ever. And she asked him, wasn't it the best he'd had ever, too? Wasn't it just absolutely the best he'd ever had? And Ben Lynch grunted prior to blowing out a breath himself and contemplating the ceiling.